going to be talking about super current subject. Essentially, we'll look at restoring social capital and how to connect dislocated workforce when we all are planning for our post-pandemic world. So I have two fantastic guest speakers joining me today. We're going to have Caoimhe Keoghan, who is Chief People Officer of Aviva. They're a British tech company who are operating globally and hire over 5,000 workers. Caoimhe previously had leadership positions in money markets and also in Google. We're also going to have John Goulding joining us today. He is CEO and co-founder of Workvivo. And Workvivo is now, I believe, fastest growing internal communication platform that is specifically designed to engage employees. And prior to that, John held leadership positions in core HR and in Dell EMC. So Caoimhe, John, welcome to Talent Summit. Thank you so much for joining me today. Hopefully you can hear me there.
All good. Yeah, good morning, Malvina. Great to be here.
Fantastic, fantastic. So let's just start, I guess, from defining the subject a little bit more, I think. So Caoimhe, I start with you, if that is okay. So from your side, what do you understand as social capital? And why do you think it is so important these days?
Great. Well, I'll try and give it a definition, Malvina, but I'm definitely not an economist. But for me, I would describe social capital as, in the workplace, it's the network of relationships that exist inside the organization. You know, outside of the formal organizational structure, we all know that the formal org structure that exists on a chart and documented processes is not actually how work gets done inside organizations, right? It is the interpersonal connection and relationships of the people that work there. So that's why it's important to me. It's that power of human connection. It's when people have shared purpose, shared values, and it's all about the goodwill and the reciprocity that exists inside organizations, which is how work actually gets done and how value gets created in businesses.
Brilliant, very good. And John, how do you see this yourself, social capital? Any different or similar to Caoimhe?
Yeah, I think very similar. I think a couple of things Caoimhe said there. It's like, for me, it's the shared values, the shared beliefs, it's the common purpose. And it's kind of summed up in the goodwill that exists in the organization. So the goodwill that exists is based on trust, it's based on relationships, and it's that glue that makes, you know, working together more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we can stay with you, John, then, therefore, what, in your opinion, impacts social talent? But I'm sure there are different situations that can obviously boost it or, quite opposite, impact it in a negative way. How do you see them?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I think this is something we're all kind of coming to have more an appreciation for, right, over the last 12 months. But I think the things that impact social capital in a positive way are human things, right? It's facilitating building of relationships. It's facilitating community. Mm-hmm. It's trying to get that shared sense of purpose, right? That shared sense of purpose. How do you do that in a digital world? And the things that impact it in a negative way are, for me, almost like the opposite of that, right? It's where you don't have recognition, you don't have those relationships, you don't have that sense of shared purpose. And I think one thing that's coming to the fore very much in the last while is, I think the synchronous overload of real-time meetings is just leading to a bit of fatigue, which definitely negatively impacts on social capital.
Absolutely. And how do you see that, Caoimhe? Anything that kind of, jumps out in your mind, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, what John said there is really interesting, right? We're all engaged in having this debate at the minute about the future of work, right? How we're going to work, where we're going to work, is it in the office, is it out of the office? But John touched on, I think, what is a really critical point, which is why we work, right? So purpose, I think, becomes increasingly important in the future, right? That shared sense of purpose and why we actually work, why we do what we do and why we choose to do it with that particular organization or company is something that I think lots of people in our roles will really have to have to help articulate in the future.
Exactly. We're going to come back to that in a little moment, if that's okay. But Caoimhe, while I have you, I just wanted to put another question to you. So, like, in a way, we all been forced into this, social experiment of sorts, where, willing or not, but we had to essentially move into all remote or nearly all remote world. And I think that most people, I say that few people enjoyed it, but most people were treating it as more kind of like baptism of fire, like a bit of a reaction to emergency situation. Now, those days are over. And as we were saying, we have to plan for the new post-pandemic world. So I was thinking, is what we experience, is that really sustainable? Because from my perspective of interacting with different, whether co-workers, managers, leaders, it seems like, people put a lot of effort and many of them are possibly at the kind of strained themselves quite a lot to make it all work. So is it sustainable is my first question, Caoimhe, to you, I guess. And then if not, is it possible that that we already used all the social capital we banked up before? Because we were in the office before, right? We were all hanging around, building culture in, face to face. Did it work because we had that before, and therefore now we really have to start building everything again from scratch in arguably more difficult circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there for sure. I've changed jobs recently, right? So I'm 6 weeks into my new role. But when the pandemic first hit in the first wave, I was at a company that I'd been at for, a couple of years. So I actually found that shift to remote relatively straightforward as somebody who had established relationships, as you say, who had built a good bit of social capital. And so therefore to go remote was relatively straightforward. It feels very different, I can tell you, joining an organization entirely remotely and having to try and build all of those relationships over Zoom when you haven't set foot in an office, while you haven't met. I mean, I didn't interview with anybody in person, right? That was all done remotely. I took the decision to join an organization without having set foot in an office, and I'm trying to build those relationships over Zoom over the past 6 weeks. And, so from a personal perspective, I can't wait until I can get into a scenario where I meet people face to face and start to build that. But to the broader question, so I think lots of people feel that way. I think lots of organizations are doing well, capitalizing on the capital that's been built. I think you'll hear a lot of people who have joined organizations during this time will say they have a different experience and have that sort of stronger desire to reconnect in person. So I think it depends a lot on your sort of situation. The other thing I would just add to, is it sustainable? It's not a true test of remote. So of course, when you talk to organizations and there are many great organizations that are designed remote first and have built their, operating models that way. And they will tell you that all of us working at home in a pandemic isn't really what remote work is like in the real world. Because yes, we're fatigued and yes, we're tired. And many of us are saying we want to get back into the office to reconnect. But that's actually because we're lacking human social connection, full stop. So working from home remotely in an all remote organization when there's not a pandemic probably feels quite different. You get your social interaction from your family and your friends and community. We don't have either, right? We don't have that, nor do we have the workplace. So it's not really for me a true test, I'll be honest, of what, because I know remote can work really well for some organizations. They design to be that way, and they don't suffer from all of this fatigue.
Absolutely. And then also another thing, maybe I'll go to John with this one, is arguably we are facing, and we touched on that a little bit, more complex environment now, right? Because as I think you Caoimhe mentioned that, we are mostly from home, so grand, we managed to deal with that. But Sigma and Aon conducted a talent survey when we were asking, what is the situation now versus what employers are planning to be in post-pandemic. And unsurprisingly now, over 80% of workers are working remotely, whether from home or from wherever they choose to. And something a little bit over 10% are in the office. And only tiny percentage in between, which leaves it around 6 or 7, are doing the hybrid situation where they're doing some kind of a mix of both, essentially, right? the responses we received suggest quite strongly that, like, at this stage, we're looking at nearly half of all the workforce doing the hybrid bit, you know, when they choose that they want to be 2 or 3 days in the office, and then the remainder half, so 50% is split between fully remote and fully in the office. So it is a little bit more difficult, you know, because we're not in exactly the same situation, or majority of us are not in the same situation. So I was just thinking, how do we make sure that we don't end up with 3 cohorts of people, as in 3 different organizations in the organization in a way? How do we kind of gel it together where, you know, different people, obviously at personal level, operate differently, but now they operate differently based on the choice they made, how they want to work? John?
No, it's funny. I was actually just thinking on Caoimhe's comments. You know, Caoimhe joined an organization in the middle of this, right? I saw something yesterday about guessing the height of your colleagues, right? Because nobody knows their colleagues' height anymore, right? And it's similar for us. Like we're 3 times the size of organization that we were when the pandemic started, right? So there's 2/3 of our workforce onboarded during a pandemic, right? Which is a very strange dynamic. I actually thought back to like 12 months ago. We were lucky enough to be on stage in Talent Summit in Dublin, Malvina.
Correct.
Like if you think back interestingly, we were talking about contingency workers, and we were talking about the future of work. And we were talking about, I remember making the point that one thing that we had observed was we were spending a lot of time in California, and a lot of the tech companies over there, we were observing that they were attending meetings on video, on Zoom, even though they were all in the same building. And it was very strange to see when you've got a meeting of 10 people and they're in the same building or they're in the same campus, but nobody turns up to a physical meeting room. And I think that's going to become the norm. I just can't see it not becoming that. So I think when we go back to the office, there will be a Zoom for every meeting, or there'll be a video which equalizes it. And it really means that if you're situated next to HQ, or if you're 5,000 miles from HQ, depending on time zone, you can still be as effective, right? But I don't see that going back to struggling for meeting rooms where you can fit 12 people and making sure that all that is in place. I think what we're using now, I think we'll end up taking the good of that into, post-pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's very interesting. I remember at the very same stage, except we were just sitting comfortably and had a big audience in front of us. I mean, we had a really good trial at forecasting the future. Unfortunately, neither you or me guessed that we're going to have a pandemic, so not so much of a fortune-telling career in front of neither of us, unfortunately. But no, you're that right. I mean, now nobody kind of flinches an eyelid when you have 10, 15 or 100 people joining a meeting virtually. And before, I bet that your first thought was like, Jesus, like what's going on here? People being a little bit lazy, can they not, change the floor to join a meeting? But that's very interesting that those kind of trends started way before the pandemic was even on the horizon.
Yeah, and like it presents an opportunity as well. I think like now you're seeing, like we host a weekly town hall meeting every week now for everybody in the company. And if we had to go back to the workplace, we just don't have a physical space big enough to do that, right? And it's very effective, and it's something that we probably would never have done had it not been spurred on by the pandemic.
Yeah,
and I think that's goodness.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I say that, Caoimhe, you can jump in here big time, because sure, like Aviva is massive, right? Like 5,000 people globally, different time zones, different countries. Never mind even that Johnny is working from 8 till 4 and, and Mary is starting at 11, So I'd say the collaboration, that's definitely part of, like, I would say, at the center of building greater social capital. How is that possible? I mean, how is it working? Because for an organization of your size, I'd imagine that would be like a second nature. Like that's obvious that that's how you do things, right? But maybe for some businesses, they're only kind of new to the concept. It seems like, where do we start with this,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, companies that are larger and global by nature with people in multiple time zones, right? We have sort of offices in 40 different countries, have already had to tackle that issue of different time zones, asynchronous communication, and how do you do that and do that well. But I think, even still, even though that was something that organizations, I think this has still presented an opportunity to become even better. It's kind of even the playing field. So, what you hear from people who were in remote or sort of smaller offices that were geographically most distant from HQ, now feel that the playing field is more even than it ever was before because of the pandemic, because you've taken everybody out of HQ and they're all at home and they're all having the same experience. So I think this is one of the real positives that has come out of it, the leveling of the playing field. And I think people are very positive about the concept of hybrid work now, right? Everybody's sort of saying, well, we've seen that we can make it work remotely. We like to keep that flexibility at future. We'll have a mix of in and out. I think the challenge is we're going to have to work hard to make sure that we don't fall back into those old ways and those old habits. To John's point, we've got to keep all of the bits that are really good, particularly those things that level the playing field for all employees and make it more inclusive. To be part of the organization. So all hands meetings, in my previous company, John, when we moved those from being physical in-person sort of weekly, bi-weekly meetings to online, what really happened and what was so wonderful to see was the volume of questions. We used to always have this section at the end where we sort of opened the floor to questions. You'd get the odd person who was brave enough to ask for the mic and ask their question in front of the company. As soon as you're doing that on a collective, Zoom meeting and people can put their questions in chat, we just started getting a level of engagement that was so much higher than we ever had. And even a couple of weeks in, we thought, we are never going back to the old way. This is where, our colleagues and employees feel comfortable engaging with leadership. This is where they feel safe to ask their questions. This is actually a brilliant development. So yeah, lots of good to keep.
Very good, very good. And then, so that brings me to something that Robert actually mentioned at the very beginning when he was introducing the Talent Summit here. Because I think that maybe in massive organizations that are used already to be doing things like this, right? So they are decentralized in a way when it comes to location anyway. It might be a little bit easier and it might be a little bit of a second nature, as you said. But for a small organization, I think that many leaders, whether they're the business leaders or they are the HR leadership side of things, I think there might be a bit of a worry that you will create a situation where still kind of closer to HQ or closer face-to-face physically to whoever, managing director or your manager, kind of the higher chances you have that you will progress your own career, you build this kind of management kind of capital. Do you think, John, that's still relevant, that's a relevant worry for organizations? And if so, how do you mitigate that, let's say the crew that comes into the office doesn't become kind of, a little bit kind of closer to information, to resources and everything else?
Yeah, I actually don't think, I think the idea of being close to HQ is I suppose it's going to be less important, right, in terms of career progression. We've just hired a head of marketing based in Barcelona. We've just hired on the East Coast of America for certain positions. We're hiring across Ireland. Like, it doesn't really matter. I think what does help is certainly time zone, right? So time zone helps, where you just have more of an opportunity to connect to people. But a word that's been mentioned a few times, I think asynchronous is definitely going to become more important. I think we're all, trying to design the ideal kind of work-life balance. And I think asynchronous just offers an awful lot in that regard. And like, you see things like podcasts now growing where they're just different ways of connecting to people. And they do play to the asynchronous. And it's actually interesting that one of the things we were asked to develop in our platform was a podcast functionality, because people are recognizing that you can, like, if you go back to, we were talking earlier about the sense of purpose, right? And that's a huge thing that influences social capital. But you can really connect people, or the best way to connect people with the purpose of the organization is personally. And you can do that one-on-one, but it's very hard to do, even in a town hall, right? You've got limited time to talk about the purpose, talk about the goals, talk about the values. But podcasting offers a kind of offline, in your own time. It's naturally a more relaxed kind of conversation, and you end up connecting to people. And I've done a few podcasts myself recently for the external world, if you like, but we publish them internally. And a lot of my colleagues have said to me, "Oh, I found that really interesting," or "You talk about culture, you talk about," and it's actually a great way for new employees coming into the company to learn about what we're about, what we value, and in a very personal way, in their own time, very conversational, having a cup of coffee. And it's just, I think it's that type of investment, I think, in terms of recognizing what works. The asynchronous world lends itself to people being based anywhere, right? Time zones are less important, location is less important, and I think the asynchronous world is going to become a much bigger thing in terms of how we work.
Absolutely, but it also probably, thinking about it now, will demand all of us, whether we're leading people or we are just partaking in the organization, to probably trust one another a little bit more, right? Because we will definitely have to rely way more on results of work of one another. There's not going to be that easy to just pick up the phone. It's like, "Hey, John, how do you do this?" Well, because John is working on the other side of the world, or might be having, or might be working a different pattern. Like, we'll have to probably find a better way of communicating that allows us to kind of, one person to complete whatever work they do, and then another person comfortably picking it up and taking it to the next level. What do you think, Caoimhe, about that?
I think that's right. I sort of start to think about different skills that you need to work effectively in an asynchronous way, to John's point. So you need to become better at documenting stuff, don't you? Right? You need to become better at sort of creating.
Unfortunately, I'd say not many of us are looking forward to this.
Right? Yeah, I know. So, how do you create those artifacts? That means that, yes, if you've got somebody sitting in, Malaysia, right? Somebody's in Asia Pac somewhere, and then, they need to pick up something whilst, the other part of the world is asleep, right? You need to find the artifact somewhere in the organization that sort of instructs you or tells you what's being done or how to do it, right? So I think there is something around documentation and being able to write succinctly, and always thinking about recording evergreen information and where do you store that, and how do people access it and how do people work. So there's definitely something around a skill set change. I really like what John said. If you play to those people who are much more comfortable communicating verbally than in written form, then podcasts and recordings and recording meetings, for example. So one of the things that they do at Aviva, which I think is really neat, is this, for those sort of town hall type things, because of the multiple time zones, we're sort of UK headquartered, so you've got a majority of the leadership team in that time zone, but we do have leaders in other time zones around the world. But we'll tend to record an all hands in the morning, so we'll do it live for those that are there and take questions, but we'll record that, and then later on in the day we'll rerun it, but we don't have to rerun the meeting. So we sort of play it as live, but then we're there to take the Q&A live. And it's a really neat solution to sort of cover time zones, give everybody the same experience, but not have the poor leaders have to, run the PowerPoint 3 times, right, in 3 different time zones.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to super quickly just jump into what John mentioned, and that's kind of the culture and the value, because I think that it's definitely, well, it's always been in a way, but definitely more now than ever, we should be looking at unique value proposition of every employer, whatever business they are in. And obviously we can't really rely on the quick fixes, the touchables, the fancy office, the bean bags, the barista bringing freshly brewed coffee in the morning and all that jazz, right? We just can't really focus on that. So everything is moving into the untouchable values and culture sphere. So how do we, I mean, communicate is one, like that's a challenge, right? But like communication is one thing. How do we create it and make sure that people do understand what we are about and, you know, why we do things the way we do them and why they should be here and not, for working for a competitor that maybe is, I don't know, throwing extra 5,000 euros for doing exactly the same job, you know? How do we go about that? Because that seems to be, well, it was never easy, as I say, but this time around, I think not only its value is way higher, but also it's a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, I think a couple of things that we're seeing people do on that, Malvina. I think like one interesting thing I thought was very effective. We saw an organization do a kind of throwback to various events that they had done in the past, right? So there's not events going on right now, but we saw people like post Halloween photographs from an event they had at Halloween or an event, you know, a summer barbecue they had, and it's the same for just things that happened in the past. People are kind of reposting them, resharing them in an attempt to kind of even give new people in the organization a sense of, you know, what the culture has been. One of the things we've seen be very effective is, and it goes back to the, you know, we talked about social capital at the start, and a big part of it is relationships and trust, and how do you do that when you haven't physically met people. And we've seen people do employee spotlights, right? It's very basic, but employee spotlights where you kind of focus on Malvina, and it's a tell me all about it, Malvina, and it's questions that talk about your first job ever, you know, a photograph of you as a kid, and it's very disarming, right? And that actually ends up helping you get to know the person. And you know, we talked at the start about it's about building goodwill in the organization, right?
Absolutely.
And that's what helps to build social capital, and ends up, you know, helping with that social glue. Hope that helps.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And Caoimhe, is there anything that you either yourself implemented or seen being implemented recently that you think it's a really good idea to kind of share with everybody in terms of building the social capital and, you know, encouraging the kind of greater understanding of what our businesses are about?
Sure. I'm going to give you two examples from Aviva, neither of which I can take credit for, because as per my point, I'm sort of 6 weeks in the door. So the brilliant team.
You have plenty of time for that.
The brilliant team that I inherited have been doing two things that I think are really, really interesting. So the first one is about culture. So Aviva as an organization is a very new organization because it's come together through various sort of different mergers and acquisitions over the year. And actually we're in the midst of another one that will see another 1,500 employees join the Aviva organization. So culture has been a big thing, right? When you're putting all of these sort of organizations together, there's been a really strong piece of work around what our desired culture is for the new Aviva and for the new organization. And doing that work with some external support, right? And being really, really clear about, you know, wanting a results-oriented learning culture, right? This is the cultural aspiration for the business. And then running a whole series of culture workshops. Because I think one of the things that creates social capital for me is shared experiences. And they were doing these workshops in person before the pandemic, but they've done them virtually since the pandemic. And it's really talking about what that, you know, aspiration is for our culture to be. And then people going through these sort of individual style profiles that sort of tells you about how you like to work and how well that is aligned with the desired culture of the organization, or where that might create tension, and then having some really interesting conversations about that. So those kind of culture, they're like culture cafes, culture workshops that employees go through. That's really powerful, I think, in terms of the connection. And then the second thing that the team has recently implemented that I think is working really, really well is recognition. So again, to John's point about social capital being about building goodwill, they've put in place this wonderful recognition portal, which I could describe as it's just a big wall of gratitude. When I log on to it on the company intranet, you just see people from all over the world giving shout outs and kudos and recognition to colleagues for doing stuff. And it all exists for everybody else to see. And that's actually really important. You know, the recognition for the individual is really important. But for somebody like me joining the organization, it gives me a great feel for the culture and for the people. Absolutely. Because I can see all of that recognition on the big wall. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just very quickly to say, like, we are actually, John, using Workvivo, and that's pretty much exactly very same feedback I get from everybody that works in Sigmar, that it's absolutely brilliant when you are working not in the office, and like yourself, Caoimhe, you maybe haven't met anybody face to face, but you can actually see this some level of social interaction and goodwill in the organisation where people are recognising one another, not only your boss praising you for good delivery of the project, but on a daily basis people can promote one another and the goodwill in the organisation. So guys, thank you so much. The half an hour just flew by, you know. The cue cards give me another, 20 questions that we should be easily talking about. But listen, thank you so much for taking time in your busy schedule and joining me today. It's Caoimhe Keoghan and John Goulding. Thank you so much.